Welcome to the Daily Horror Habit Podcast. I'm your host, Jay Krieger, bringing you daily reviews of current and classic horror movies for your twisted pleasure. Be aware that these reviews and discussions may include spoilers. And as always, I hope you enjoy.
I want you to know something, Wilson. Now, I don't enjoy driving anybody to death row. You try anything. Anything. I've got 2 guards with shotguns, and I'll blow you apart.
Sure could use a smoke.
You understand me, Wilson?
You mumble a little bit. I get the general idea.
Let's go.
Slip right out of the chair.
Yeah. I don't sit in chairs as well as I used to.
Get him up.
All right, let's go.
Welcome to another installment of my year-long Masters of Horror celebration, in which I'm joined by a guest every Friday to chat about one of their favorite films from our month's featured director. For the month of January, we're honoring none other than the legendary Rebel of Horror himself, John Carpenter. Today's episode highlights Carpenter's second feature film, 1976's Assault on Precinct 13, which follows a prison transport that's diverted to a defunct LA police precinct the same night a bloodthirsty street gang descends upon the station to enact revenge against a man taking refuge there. Now Highway Patrolman Ethan Bishop and the station secretary Lee must form an unlikely partnership with 2 convicts, Napoleon Wilson and Wells, if they wish to survive the assault. And joining me today to chat about Carpenter's exploitation action western is BloodyDisgusting.com's video game editor Neil Bolt. Neil, welcome to the show, man.
Hi, thanks for having me on to talk one of the greats.
Absolutely. I hadn't actually revisited this film in a couple of years, and it was one that I came to really late compared to a lot of the other Carpenter movies, right? Like, I was pretty spoiled. I started with The Thing and then Halloween, and then, of course, I started tracking down all his other films to watch, and this was one of the later ones just because I was like, oh, well, it's like not a horror film. It's an action kind of Western-styled film, and yet in revisiting it, it very much is a film that just because it's not horror, it feels distinctly like a Carpenter film. It has all of the qualities of his later films that I love so much. And it's really the film that kind of introduces you to that style, and you just get to watch him build on that throughout the course of his career.
Yeah, it's like, because a lot of Carpenter's work has a throwback quality to sort of earlier American action cinema anyway. And like, you know, Assault on Precinct 13 in particular is Western in all but name. It's as people have said, some people go, oh, it's like Night of the Living Dead, forgetting that Night of the Living Dead is copying Rio Bravo, which is where this, again, copies like that. This weirdly does kind of look like it's, you know, being the 70s, if Dawn of the Dead had been more just like the Night of the Living Dead again, you know, you could have done that whole scenario just as well. Then it's great. But it's, as you say, not horror in the traditional sense, but it has definitely got those qualities that make it a Carpenter joint, if you will.
Absolutely. And I'd like to kind of start by asking you your Carpenter origin story. Do you remember the first Carpenter film you saw?
Well, funnily enough, it was indeed this one. It's like, though Halloween and The Thing did come afterwards, and Christine, I think, as well, were among that sort of bunch. Christine, because, you know, I'd read the book and I was like, oh, yeah, that'd be cool. But yeah, this one, I used to stay around a friend's house like a lot during the summers and stuff, and we'd watch all sorts of stuff. Like, it's the first time I watched films like Candyman, there's films like The Dragon, the Bruce Lee story, even the Karate Kid stuff. And this happened to be one of the films we ended up watching one night. It was like, with no context of who John Carpenter is at this point, or whatever. But, you know, had a soft spot for Westerns anyway, a soft spot for this whole, you know, style of siege films, if you will. I love that. It's like, you know, I'd already seen Night of the Living Dead as well, so that was in a good reference point. And yeah, I don't know, it just had that thing I like in a lot of movies where it's like, it evokes the quality of time gone by in a different era, you know. And I don't know, that it took a while before I realized, yeah, as I said, it was who John Carpenter was beyond that. And I think probably then when it came to watching Halloween on TV one night on Halloween, and that sealed the deal for me, where I was like, oh yeah, I like these films, I really like them. And it snowballed from there. I saw The Thing, that was like, you know, those two those three are basically, they're my top three still to this day. So it's nothing, yeah, as good as a lot of the other films are. That film though in particular, Assault on Precinct 13, just starts such a great streak of films for him. Even with the TV movie stuff, and yeah, so it holds a special place in my heart for that. With the nostalgic value of it.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think that's that's very relatable to a lot of us, right? We all kind of came to a Carpenter joint, going over to a friend's house or something, kind of like, hey, there's this crazy movie that I have that you've never seen anything like it. And I feel that at a certain age, that is true, right? He makes these very kind of polarizing movies, no matter the genres, and he jumps around to a lot of different genres. And yet, every movie that he makes, it definitely feels as if like you realize you're watching something that is different. It's great. This is like greatness to a certain degree, whether you have the context of who John Carpenter is. I mean, when we're all kids watching it for the first time, we lack that context, right? Because we're kids. We don't know any better, obviously. And I mean, getting to grow up with the internet like myself and getting to then be like, oh man, I remember seeing this as a kid. Why don't I go back and see what else that guy made? And then IMDb, there's this whole treasure trove essentially of all of the Carpenter films that I obviously missed, or I wasn't fortunate enough to have friends that had heard of it. I was like, oh, I enjoyed The Thing. Why don't I check out this other movie that he made? This is an action movie though. Assault on Precinct 13. Like, how could that be as good? And then you realize like The Thing, it doesn't matter the types of story he's telling, just because that sense of style, I feel like it transcends everything he makes.
With this and, with my three favorites, there's a common thread amongst them, which is it's a very contained place in each of them. It's like the Haddonfield obviously is like the biggest area, if you will, of the three. They all, they don't stretch too far beyond their boundaries. It's like Russian dolls of levels of isolation, if you will. It's like where the thing is this whole thing, they are literally isolated. There's no one else around for miles and miles. Then you get to Assault on Precinct 13, where it's like they're in the middle of a city, but somehow, because it's a bad neighborhood and they're shutting down, it's isolated and no one's coming because they've cut the phone lines and such. And then, as you said, Haddonfield, because it's Halloween night, everyone else is out partying, and it's like they are very much again alone. And I like that isolation in those films, and not knowing what's coming, that night or in that day for you. A seemingly normal situation, no matter how mundane, whether you be at an ice station, a closing down police station or whatever. That's the greatness of it. It's like normal situation. Here's what's going to bring them all together, straight into it. And Carpenter really works well with that. I think he's probably struggled the most when he does start going beyond that, trying to sprawl out a bit. And yeah, I mean, even Prince of Darkness, I think, as well, is another one where it's small, mostly single location, and it works because of that. Definitely his key strength, I think.
For sure. And I actually just revisited Prince of Darkness recently, and that is one of the very qualities of it that on a rewatch, I picked up on a lot more and I appreciated more, and that it is a solo location. To a certain extent, it has a quality of Siege in it where they're trapped in that location, in that church. But it is this idea again, like, you might as well be on another planet because nobody outside of that church in that film can help you or realizes what's going inside. People are just kind of walking by on the street and nobody really realizes. And your example of Halloween, I mean, Halloween, it's an entire town and you can still you can come and go from the town. But what about Halloween? Like, I live in the suburbs, and the Halloween film was the first slasher that I saw that it wasn't set at a camp. It wasn't dealing with like magic to a certain extent, right? I'd seen Leprechaun prior and I was like, oh, this is like goofy, but I mean, hey, it's like, it's fun or whatever. But with Halloween, it was like, there's a guy with a knife walking around a neighborhood that looks just like mine and nobody can track him. Like, it made that type of film very real in a way that I hadn't seen before in a slasher. And that's why Halloween is like you said, it's one of your favorites. It's one of my favorites, just because the film does a very good job of kind of weaponizing your typical American or suburb, and it does it in a way that it just feels very real, in a way that like Friday the 13th never did for me, to a certain extent. Like Nightmare on Elm Street didn't, even though that's all about suburbs, but that's again like more of the magic angle, and I barely sleep anyways, so I don't worry about that too much. But in terms of just like Carpenter's work in general, why does Assault on Precinct kind of stand out to you the most?
It does come back to this. Its position in his filmography is one of those things. I mean, you look at that leap between 1974 to 76 to 78, where he goes from Dark Star, which is the weakest point in his proper film. I get that budget constraints, young filmmaker, and all that. But yeah, it was the one film I was like, I'm struggling to finish this. And it's like whereas even stuff like Memoirs of an Invisible Man, I can, it was good enough, even though it's very non-Carpenter, because it had Chevy Chase being Chevy Chase, and so that works. But yeah, then you go Halloween, and it's like, though the jump is less incremental between those two, and compared to the other, it's still amazing to see this change in the space of a few years between those. It's like to see everything that he can do is in Assault on Precinct 13. Everything you see in, as we were just saying there, we had all these films that have a feel to them, and they all come from that. They definitely don't come from Dark Star. Dark Star is very much not really a Carpenter film in the traditional sense now, as we know. That's where he finds his style. Everything I like about Carpenter films comes from it as a result. And like I said, all the best ones I find tend to copy some part of that formula. But again, the other part, as I said, is growing up on Sunday morning TV and westerns and things where it would be on the telly all the time, and my dad would watch Clint Eastwood stuff, and even later, like where I'd watch like Lucio Fulci's his westerns and things. It's like I love something about them that feels timely, no matter what. What's the one I'm thinking of? There's like Sergio Leone's films obviously copy Kurosawa's in terms of that style, so even they aren't inspired. It's like another step in that,
right? Yeah,
it's like Kurosawa inspired Leone inspired other people, and it carried on. And Carpenter, I would imagine, partially inspired by that. But I think the other thing as well is the music. Again, it was the first soundtrack where I was like, this really hits in an interesting way. Those opening sort of heartbeat-esque, dum, dum, dum bits, and that sort of permeate throughout the film. It's the first time I really noticed a soundtrack. It isn't like a big John Williams score. It was just like, wow, this catches my attention. And I think it was a couple of years ago now. It was breathtaking to see Carpenter perform that live, amongst. It's just hearing it in this big like hall with the atmospherics and things like that, and just hearing the thump. It was wow. It took me back in a weird way. It's in video game terms, it's when you get like a remake or a remaster of an old game, and when it captures it just right, it nails exactly how it felt to you then. So you almost feel like it's the same thing, but it's clearly been updated and overhauled and refreshed. And that was just how he did it that night. To understanding his own music that well, it's like, I've got the heart of it, and now I've changed it slightly for a modern audience. And he did that with many of his soundtrack choices really well with the anthology albums.
I'm very jealous that you got to see him live. That's fantastic.
Oh man, yeah. So I'm wearing the tour shirt. So
well, in getting to revisit Assault on Precinct 13 to talk with you today, that is the first thing that I really am taken with is the score. It's just the opening. Before you even see the credits, you hear that soundtrack, that synthesizer coming through in a way that, if you're familiar with Carpenter, you're expecting that to a certain degree because he's so synth heavy in his films, and yet it's so polished and it feels so fresh. And like you kind of said, this updating on it feels radically different from what you're expecting. Like what you said in terms of the kind of big orchestral scores and things like that, it feels very radical. And I think that that's kind of a testament to, I described him as being like a rebel filmmaker, or the horror rebel filmmaker, because he does so many things that feel radically different. You wouldn't expect a score like that in a film that is at the core of this film. It's a modern updating on a Western, right? And so for him to start it with that soundtrack, which is just, I mean, it's a banger. There's no other way to describe it. No matter how many years later, I mean, it's still as fresh and it sounds as riveting, and yet it grabs your attention, and it shows the early steps of Carpenter just being able to craft tension from the opening moments of his movies. And it does so in a way that, I mean, I'm not expecting that when I go into a Western or I'm going into an action film, right? I'm expecting there to be action, obviously, and kind of these standoffs and things, and yet I'm very rarely kind of captivated from the credits, from before I meet a character, right? Usually with those types of films, you have to get a little bit of investment going. But Carpenter's style, I mean, he's able to show off or basically give a preview of what's in store for the audience before you even get invested in anybody, before you even meet any characters. And I think that is something that makes this film so special and so unique, in that you're getting that from this guy who, this is his second film. And I haven't seen Dark Star, but from everything I've heard, like, it's not nearly as indicative of his overall filmmaking style and kind of music sensibilities as much as this film is. Yeah,
it's definitely, it's more of a, I don't want to say gun for hire sort of film, because it's not. He clearly wanted to do it. It's just, it doesn't have anything, because it's, I've got the other guy who does it now.
Dan O'Bannon?
Dan O'Bannon, that's it. I was trying to think, the Alien, right? Yeah. It's clearly his baby, in a way, and that shines through more than the Carpenter side of things. I mean, it's not without redemption. It's just, it's boring a lot of the time, and it's maybe not naff in the right way. Some people I get it, and they like it for what it is, and understandable. It's like, much as there are people that don't like Escape from LA, and that's like, I think it's amazing. It's the Metal Gear Solid 2 of sequels, Carpenter sequel. It's just like, it's him going, oh, you wanted a sequel? Well, here you go. It's like, I'm going to give you the most non-sequel ever.
Well, I guess I don't want to speculate too much on a film I haven't seen, but I would assume that Dark Star being the first film experience that he has, and it not coming out, I'm sure, the way exactly he wanted it, and like you said, he has to work with another creative. That's probably indicative of why his best films, the majority of them, like, he's either doing the score, he's directing, he's writing them, you know what I mean? It's him taking on double duty on a lot of his films, so that way he has that creative control. And I mean, sure, there are some films that he didn't write that are fantastic, but I think early on, a lot of his best work is the ones that he's doing either pulling two or three different types of roles in them, because those are the most indicative of his style. And I mean, that comes through in Assault on Precinct 13 in a way that when I first watched it, again, I didn't kind of have the entire Carpenter filmography in mind, or the sort of exposure to his other works. And so on a rewatch, again, it's just like, how could you not watch this movie and then not appreciate just how talented and how strong of a filmmaker he is from the jump, and then being able to trace that through his filmography of, okay, he's able to expand on this element, and then he's able to expand on the music in a way that's really good here. Like, it's a remarkable film for what it is. I mean,
it's the fact that it's 90 minutes long, and yet it takes its own time to get stuff done. It sets stuff up fairly well, but doesn't give you the key moment until much later in the film. It's like, I mean, the longest time I watched between it, I came back to it thinking, how did they end up getting to the police station again with this? It's like, and then of course the key thing is that scene, the big shocking scene at the time of it. But the next time I ever saw it mentioned was in a magazine. They were doing like all of these shocking scenes from movies, which was a good gateway thing, because it showed me stuff like that. There were scenes from Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead that were like, oh, I want to see this, and Society, and I was like, oh, it's great. That list provided many great discoveries. I'll say that. It's that kid's death leading to this is just. I know we're jumping ahead here for this, but it's like
no, it's perfect.
Yeah, but it's shocking in the sense that it's done so casually. There's no anger behind it. There's no malice, no contempt. He just very casually shoots a little girl for coming up and asking if she got the wrong ice cream. It's just nuts. You know.
I mean, that is what is so shocking, I think, about the violence in general about this film. And it's a testament to this. It makes sense why this film, the violence in this film feels so different for me than the rest of his films, right? He's no stranger to violent movies and blood and gore and everything throughout his career. And yet coming back to this movie, it might be because he is so young, and in his own words, like he was like, oh, I was a young and dumb filmmaker. I don't know if it's that is why there's so much flippancy, right? He has no qualms about kind of just casually throwing out violence that is very shocking and sudden. And like you said, it doesn't have a lot of anger or necessarily emotional stakes in it. It's just shocking in what it is. And it's very, I mean, before you even get to the kid being killed, the film opens up with the gang members getting gunned down in the alley. And to me, that is kind of a shocking scene because, again, usually in films, you're used to people, he drew on me first. That's kind of like the Western thing, right? I'm not going to gun you down until you draw your gun on me. And yet there's a group of teenagers essentially, or young adults that are like, they're fleeing the scene and they just get gunned down and you see blood and everything splashing on the walls. And for me, I mean, at this point, like pretty desensitized to most violence in movies, but just how casually he kills all those characters in a matter of seconds, and we don't know anything else about the film yet because that's how the film opens. Yeah, I mean, it's a shockingly affecting opening for that sets the tone very well, I think. Yeah,
and it shows the gang's numbness to violence as it is later, when the father of the child goes on a revenge mission to go and kill the guy that killed her, and they retaliate without thinking about, well, is it not a bit silly to be retaliating with a whole gang of us against one guy? No, apparently not. That's it. And they do. It's like they don't care that they killed a child, but they are very annoyed that that one guy that killed a child got killed. And it's like, it's that I find fascinating. And again, has that old West feel that I think of Once Upon a Time in the West, which is one of the meaner ones in that regard, where they're like, fuck it, we're not gonna care if we kill anyone in the line of work. It happens. It's like it's that kind of cool. Even like Fulci's westerns kind of have a lot of that, whereas I think Silver Saddle opens with like this kid gets his dad gets his brains blown out in front of him pretty much as a kid, sets him out on this revenge mission for the rest of the film growing up. But it's like, I like that, and it works so well for it, I think.
Again, like him being such a young filmmaker, it's shocking that he's able to pull it off as casually as he does, right? I mean, it happens and then he moves on. And what I was really surprised about was how fluidly, again, you mentioned like it's such a brisk and snappy 90-minute film. Yeah. And the setup, I think, there's not a ton of depth there, and yet he's able to do a really great job of kind of building the world, introducing 3 separate storylines. We have the prison transport, there's Bishop reporting to the station, and then you have the gang. And he's able to introduce 3 sets of characters, 3 different events that are going on, and he's able to include those like timestamps and locations for everything, which, I mean, the locations don't mean anything to me, but it still is affecting in that it establishes the location. It establishes some sort of geography in the sense that the movie begins and it almost feels like a documentary in a certain way, like a true crime documentary. Yeah. That I think it lends a lot to something that is so simple. I mean, it's a prison movie. It's about a siege and things like that. And it's kind of extrapolating, or it's a modern updating on the Western like Alamo movies. But at the same time, he's able to make it very palatable, I feel like, for the time, like the modern audience. But even now, I think that is what has allowed the film to hold up as well as it does.
I think that comes through mainly, in the one character, which is Napoleon, where, he is if any character is the absolute throwback while still being a very modern version of it, it's him, because he is the old bandit, the old bandit cowboy guy in to be hanged. Off they take him, but no, here he is. He's teaming up with the good guy cop, who, again, very good that they didn't make him like this. Oh, look at him, he's just so naive because he's so good and proper and wholesome. That bounces off well with Napoleon, and it's like, even though they're different sides of this fight in one way, they work well together because there's a common thread through them. Where like, well, we want to live through this night. That's it, and we'll do everything. And then there's a level of respect that comes between them as the film goes on, and ends just perfectly as it does with that.
And that contrasted to the violence, where the violence is, like we said, it's so mean and it's so nasty. That doesn't rub off onto the characters. And that captures, I think, like the core of a Western, in that it's very much about these people that are unlikely allies, and yet they have to form some type of like temporary friendship or agreement between one another if they want to live to see another day. And I think had he not focused on that so much, and like you said, having Napoleon and Bishop play off one another so well, the film doesn't work, I think, as long as it does. In between, kind of, once we get into the full siege, when it's focusing on their back and forth banter and whatnot, I don't know if that relationship had not been established, that those kind of like downtime in between waves of the siege would work nearly as well as they do.
Yeah, I think this is true in the remake, is that the way they get wrong, especially in that relationship, is that they make it more about bickering, you know, about, oh, you know, I'm right, you know, look at you, you're making stupid decisions being a good guy. Oh, you're bad because you're a bad guy. It's like they don't have time to argue it. So in the original, so they're just, yeah, okay. It's like, I know no one's dying here. Why should I let you die here? You know, his belief in justice is, you know, you're supposed to die by execution. So as a policeman, my job is to make sure that's what happens. It's like, and weirdly, you know, they're on the same page for that. It's like, was it? Napoleon himself says, "I've been out of time since I was born." You know, it's he's resigned to the fact that he's not coming out of this, which is, you know, something that you don't really think about necessarily until the end. You're like, well, you know what? They don't just go, "Oh, I'll go on, you go escape, you little scamp," because yeah, just because you've done me a solid and been a good guy. They both know it's like, I'm going to uphold the law, whatever, but I respect you. So I'm going to take a walk with you here, even though you are going to ultimately die, because, you know, whatever you did is going to get you that punishment.
And I think that is at the core, again, of this being a Western, in that there's that kind of like mutual respect for one another, and it's, okay, we're going to uphold this agreement. And there's not going to be, I mean, not to say there's never any double crossing in Westerns, but the film being constructed as a Western, I think, for me, is what makes that relationship work so well. And had it not, it might have came, like you said in the remake, I guess there's a lot of bickering and things like that. At the end of that film, if they spend the whole time at each other's throats, I would expect one of them to break the agreement that they had, right? Somebody try to double cross somebody else. Whereas in this, at the end of the film, let's say Napoleon spins around and shoots Bishop and escapes through the vent in the basement. Yeah. That would not feel like a apt ending, because it would almost feel like, oh, well, he betrayed the kind of honor code that they had. And I feel that wouldn't make sense for the world that Carpenter crafted in this.
No, this is it. And that is a very good point. It just makes it, I mean, he has the opportunity, you know, to go do that. You know, the character could easily have just turned around and said, "Yep, I'll go." They could have, in another film, like I said, they could have made that the thing, the happy ending. Oh, go on, you go escape while we pretend we didn't see you. And it's like, and it would have been totally viable, because by the time they'd all sorted everything out, oh, you escaped in the ruckus, etc. But they didn't, and I like that about it. Like I said, this whole film goes around with Bishop and his sense of justice and wanting to do right, because he's a, you know, fresh on the beat cop who wants to prove himself. He's a lieutenant, isn't he? And yeah, he wants to prove his worth, and he's still not cynical enough to be not see the good in someone, even if they are, you know, worthy of death, it seems so.
And that is the core of Bishop's character, I think, in that Bishop's character eventually decides that he's going to let the two criminals out of the cell so they can help repel this assault. Had it not been Bishop and the shift commander that he relieves had been the one in Bishop's shoes, he would have just left them in the cells to die, and then eventually they would have gotten overthrown. And that is what I think is so interesting about Bishop's character, in that he's not willing to sacrifice his view and his kind of upholding of the law, and yet he's willing to see some semblance, no matter how like slight of a sliver, of goodness in a person. He's like, well, we can use that in a way that, again, it doesn't result in the film being this bickering back and forth, which now that you mention that, like, I'm so thankful that the film isn't just that, right? It's not them being like, well, you're a goddamn criminal, so like, of course you want to just kill everybody or something like that. And it's like,
Yeah, it's something that gets seen so often. You expect it in a lot of films these days, where you just think, oh yeah, of course, good guy, bad guy, the anti-hero thing. They're not going to get on until the end. And it's overplayed, and I like that again that it just wasn't the case here at all.
And now for a brief intermission. If you've been enjoying this episode of Daily Horror Habit, please take a moment to subscribe to the show on your preferred streaming platform or leave us a review on iTunes. And thank you for your continued support, and I hope you enjoy the remainder of today's horrifying episode. I had forgotten also how funny a lot of the dialogue is and how snappy it is. It's something that I was really impressed with in Carpenter, in that he was, I mean, granted, they had such a strong core of 4 actors for the film, and yet the dialogue is so snappy, and it's very tongue-in-cheek in a lot of different ways. And of course, like Napoleon Wilson, who's played by Darwin Jostin, does such a fantastic job of selling it. Like when he's getting moved to the prisoner's bus, and then the prison warden just like sucker elbows him in the back of the head, and he's like, oh, I don't sit in chairs as well as I used to. And like little moments like that, or his recurring like anybody got a smoke bit that comes up throughout the film. I mean, there's so many great little moments of dialogue between these characters that it sells this kind of temporary friendship or temporary agreement, right? It feels very organic, despite the fact that these are two people from two opposite sides of the law. They're able to find a common ground in a certain vernacular almost with one another that works really well. And again, I mean, not to keep perseverating on it, but it's so easily could have just been them bitching about I'm good and you're bad for the 40 minutes in the between of this movie. Yeah,
which, ironically, when you go to something like The Thing, is what a bunch of people who know each other very well end up doing. It's like, and that's the difference. But it works there because it's a bunch of people who know each other so well that they're worried that someone isn't who they say they are. So it brings something into a trusted group in isolation. Going back to what you're saying, with the dialogue, there are just, he gets so many great little zingers. I remember the bit where Charles Cypher's character is in the bus with him, asking him about, why you like this? And he goes, you're not a psychopath, you're not stupid. And he says, but I am an arsehole, you can't take everything away from me. It's like...
Yeah. Well, also, like, to go back to the fact that he is very much a sort of anti-hero from a Western, in that he has that mysterious quality, right? Nobody it's never revealed why he's on death row. Obviously, if he's on death row, it can't be for anything good, but it's never revealed. And he is even very coy about it when people ask him. He's like, you want to ask me, don't you? To multiple people. And everybody is very inquisitive. And yet he's like, yeah, maybe I'll tell you one day or something like that. And then towards the end, when they think that they're about to get overrun by the gangs, he's like, oh, I might be able to tell you a lot sooner or something like that, which I love. Just, again, it's a recurring element to his character that makes him mysterious, and yet he's a death row inmate that we want to see live. I find that such a rare quality. He's a guy that, by all accounts, is a scumbag murderer, and yet throughout the film, you're like, this guy, I don't want this guy to die.
Exactly, yeah. It puts that seed of doubt in there. But, when that character is referred to by other people, and they bring up his name, I think when Bishop's told the name, and he's like, he clearly knows who he is, so he's clearly like a big deal has happened with him. And I think they mentioned he killed people, plural, so it's a case of why, and I think that's the thing, no one knows why he did it, and that's why people are fascinated by him in the movie as well. But he clearly knows how to handle himself, and you can see that yes, it's quite possible that this is a man who murdered multiple people. You see when he gets chucked the shotgun and he just does that over the shoulder, ka-ching, done like that. He's efficient and very cool. And going back to that Western thing, the way everyone's eyes are lit, and you notice the shadows are positioned differently, especially during that last few shots where the different parts of their face are sort of highlighted very well, and it just has that sort of look of the eyes thing, which is a very Western thing to do.
Absolutely. And before we kind of move on from dialogue, I have to mention the scene when Bishop goes to get coffee, and Lee says black, and he goes, for over 30 years. Like that line kills me every time, and it's such a goofy like line that I don't think his character has many kind of like just overtly humorous lines throughout the film. He has a couple, but I mean that line stands out so well in just Carpenter's ability to capture multiple different types of voices. You know what I mean? I find that sometimes it's very rare that, well, I don't know if I should overgeneralize, but it's not always the case where a creative decides that they're going to write and direct, right? Sometimes it comes off, it's like, did they really need to write that? Could their time have been spent better either just focusing on writing or just focusing on directing? And the dialogue in this shows just how versatile Carpenter is from such an early stage in his career. I mean, basically he's green behind the ears, right? It's his second movie, and his ability to kind of capture multiple voices, and for the most part, I mean, the character, it's such a small cast. I feel like characters aren't necessarily wasted. Granted, the guy that comes to take refuge in the police station, I mean, he doesn't say anything for the entire movie, but his character at least serves a purpose in terms of pushing the plot forward, right? The thugs that are descending on the siege, they want to get to him. It's not really important that he says anything, I suppose, because we saw why, right? He guns down the guy that murders his daughter so flippantly.
Again, and it's again speaks to the strength of justice that Bishop seeks, you know, where he doesn't care what he has or hasn't done or what's happened to him. It's like he came in asking us for help. That's it. You know, we're going to help him. And that's it. And it's clearly he's needing help from people who are out to kill him. It's more likely he's going to need help than they are. So it's good that they leave it ambiguous and they don't just have him suddenly have this, because there's a bit near the end where you think he's just going to suddenly turn around and go, well, what happened was blah 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 blah.
Right.
And or they killed her, they killed my daughter, that sort of thing. Seemed like it could happen, but again, there's a cynicism and with the friendship side of everything going on, but not cynical to the point where it's like, you know, cloying, like, okay, we get it, everything's terrible and believe. It's like, because that's in Bishop, they have this character who finds hope in everything, and without being, you know, plucky, happy-go-lucky guy, he's just like he understands the world is shit. The place he's doing, what he's doing is, he understands what he's doing is a shit job, and the situation gets shitter and shitter. But yeah, he does what he has to do to get through it. Again, because he has his sense of what is right and wrong, and employs it in a very non-cynical way. He's, you know, the non-cynical part of the entire film, and that, as we said, rubs off on other characters throughout, because, you know, they don't know him. He's the other newcomer in this story. It's like it makes, you know, he is infectious in that regard. And like I said, they end up rubbing off on each other a little bit, you know, in terms of respect. And yeah, it's fascinating to think that, because it's such a simple premise for a film, and, you know, there's not much, you know, the dialogue that is there isn't, you know, greatly going into detail about the characters, but you can pick up on these things just in the way the story goes. As you said, there are very easy things to do in that story that they don't do, as we said, you know, with the bickering and the double crossing, and a lot of ambiguity left in. And again, that just speaks to the strength of it. And
it never becomes that kind of like, I'm holier than thou because I'm good, right? We never get any kind of overbearing monologues where where Bishop's beating everybody over the head with the fact that I am the law, right? You never get that kind of.
I think, again, yeah, that comes from, again, where, you know, he brings up that, you know, he grew up around this bad area and he understands it a bit. And I think that again feeds into him as a character, that, you know, he gets why people might turn to crime and why they might be in that, but at the same time, he wants to be different to that. So
on this rewatch, I kind of interpreted this as this being Carpenter's kind of like incredibly anti-authority film. And I kind of wanted to bounce some ideas off you just to see if you agree or not, because this is a movie that it's 1976, I believe. It's not it's not an accident that the lead is a black man. It's not a uncalculated decision to make him the figurehead in this world. And I think that it's very interesting that he's a cop. He's a cop in a position of power, and we get those brief moments when he enters the station where, I don't know if I'm reading too much into it, but I almost feel like the two white cops that are working there at the police station almost like treat him kind of like a joke, right? That one cop that's working at the desk, he's a lieutenant, and the guy doesn't even bother like looking up when he walks in, and he's kind of
in
like,
fact, he's very sardonic when he goes, "Oh, you know, sir," sort of thing, and it's like he's just, you know, and yeah, I think the fact that he gets given this job to begin with is pretty much like, you know, it's like we don't want to give you anything interesting to do, so let's give you this boring, what they think is going to be a boring job for the night. And yeah, and again, that runs through the whole film again, and how he feels and how he sort of bonds with Napoleon, because, you know, it's like they get it. You know, it's like people look down on them and think this certain way of them as people, and they came through it anyway. And it's like, so it's like I want to, you know, walk side by side with you out here, because, you know, as far as I'm concerned, you know, you're as good a guy as me in a tight spot.
Yeah, and I thought that kind of, again, feeds into this anti-authority, in that just kind of like the portrayal of police in general, I feel, is not a necessarily super favorable one, right? I mean, the film begins with the cops gunning down gang members that had weapons, but they were running away, right? It's not this kind of like back and forth shootout where it's like, yeah, you're fighting for your life, you have to protect yourself. It's essentially, it seems like a group of kids that are like running away. And then you have like Napoleon getting beat, and it's not even like addressed or anything, right? It's kind of like, oh yeah, this is just what we do. I'm just going to elbow this prisoner in the back of the head and then make a joke about it, to the degree that the other cop there that's in charge of the transport, he kind of just like gives the warden the look like, yeah, I'm a cop, I'm not going to say anything, but it's like, I don't know if that's how we should be doing things necessarily.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of that into it, I'd say. Yeah, it makes sense in a lot of ways, I'd say.
Yeah, and even like the prison transport cop gives Bishop like a ton of shit for, like, the phones are out and all of this kind of chaos is happening, and yet like Bishop just got there essentially. None of this is his fault, and he's like, "Oh, you run this is like a chicken shit operation," or he says something to that extent. And it's one of those
there's like when he's already said to him, it's like, we have nothing. Yeah, we're closed. it's like, people do just tend to ignore him, apart from the few people who don't really have power. It's noticeable, you know, in the receptionist as well. It's you can see that sort of correlation between them.
Mm-hmm. And kind of just, again, coming back to this idea that it's obviously this is not a horror film, and yet there's a lot of elements to it that feel reminiscent of Carpenter's later horror films, of course. Like we have this kind of like the build up to the siege, where first the phone lines are cut, then the power's cut, and then, oh, that other cop fell down in front of the police station, and then they realize like, no, he was just murdered in front of the police station. And then of course it escalates from there, and that kind of bleeds into the portrayal of the street gang, which, again, I had seen this movie only for the first time a couple years ago, and then kind of getting to expose myself to more and more and more horror films, of course. It's almost like you can't not see this as being a heavily influenced film from like Night of the Living Dead, right? Because the gang, they literally walk. None of them really run until like things officially pop off, but they're basically walking out of the darkness and the shadows, and then they're just ready to go, and they're just ready to prey upon the station in a way that's like super unsettling for a action film. Yeah,
it is very, and I think, you know, it had influence on parts of Resident Evil 2 in later years. You know, the police station there has a lot of moments like that, you know, and even to a point, Resident Evil 4, when there's the whole siege mission in that, has a lot of similarities. So it did actually then jump back into horror in other places, so it had its influences there. But for me, like, I think it was a decade ago now, I used to work as a night porter at a hotel, and this film always came to my mind in terms of thinking, well, you know, it's an ordinary night, it's quiet, but anyone could walk in that door and things could change, just like that, and you're on your own. And sometimes things did happen like that. No, not to this extreme, clearly, but otherwise I'd be telling you that story straight out the gate.
Right.
But no, like, you know, you'd get like weekend parties, and someone will bring some people back that didn't belong in the hotel, and then it's like your job to go and make sure they leave. And it's like you get those moments where you're like, this could turn ugly, and it's like that is where the horror for me ended up being with that years later. And it was just like, Jesus, man, that film has ruined me for being in a strange way. Yeah, there's always just this point in the night when you can, until everybody is in this hotel like they should be at night and I've locked up, this is always that chance that something off is going to happen. Yeah, it was a new appreciation for that film as a result.
Absolutely. The unknowing of what can come out of the dark, right? I mean, again, a strength of the film in that regard is that it's ironic that like the police station is supposed to be viewed as like a place of safety, and yet it's the place where hell is unleashed on this part of LA for the evening. I think also it's interesting too, just Carpenter's ability to make something so standard in action movies or in crime movies, which is like a gang. Okay, it's a gang. Like we've seen that before, and yet he gives them this almost like supernatural quality in starters because they are seemingly endless. Usually a gang is like 20, 30 guys, and in this, it's just a never-ending horde. But then he does things like they barely speak, which makes them seem like not people. They, again, like I said a minute ago, a majority of the time they're walking early on. They're not even like running or being evasive. They are later in the film, but they're introduced as being just very kind of passive. And then they even have like that weird blood oath at the beginning of the film, which is just like very strange and very weird in a way that, you've probably seen something like that before, but such a brief little seemingly innocuous moment, it makes them seem like it's a threat that normal people can't deal with almost. Yeah,
I think one that comes back to me when I think of like gangs with that sort of rituals to them, I think of in Predator 2 with the Colombians.
Oh yeah,
where they have all the blood rituals and stuff like that, and it's so over the top and like crazy, and like they're going, they're all crazy because it's the end of the 80s and coke, and it just, you see this and it's very different, as you say, and has that zombie-like quality. And the other thing is it's a very multicultural gang. It's not. It's like there's no one focus. It's like it's not pointing out and I think maybe that's a deliberate choice, because again it goes back to this like it can come from crime can come from anywhere. It's not necessarily about being in one ethnicity or one group that caused the trouble. It's like it comes from everywhere, and I think another thing with that, the police station being shut down, is another way of thinking. Like it feels like the police have given up on this area. They're saying we'll wash our hands of this area. Let the criminals just take it, because we couldn't handle it, but it was too much, and that's it. And that's why they're so passive and apathetic to everything. It's just like, this is our place. We do what we want. It's like, and they know it.
That's a really great point, because when Bishop gets to the station, the sergeant is telling him about all the influxes of calls that they're getting about all these violent crimes and property crimes, to the point where you're like, why the fuck are you guys closing the station down? It sounds like you all have plenty of work to do. Like, it doesn't sound like there's a shortage of things to do here. So that, I think, is a great point. But also, going back to the multicultural nature of the gang, I think the example of Predator 2 is that, like, that's kind of like the stereotypical portrayal of like the Jamaicans or whatever, pick your ethnicity group and we're going to portray it. I mean, granted, that film feels like it was solely fueled on coke and madness.
That film is coke it's just coke.
But so that in itself, like, there's these stereotypical caricatures of people, and it's like the whole movie is kind of ridiculous in a certain way. But not to say it's without total redeeming values, but I love it. But there's definitely some moments in that film that don't get its shine, I think, in terms of just it being a sequel. But what I was going to say is that Carpenter, he decided on purpose to make the gang multicultural, right? That was something that he had in mind. And I think that, like you said, if it's kind of like, it has nothing to do with, this one group is bad or these two groups are bad. If it's a multicultural gang that has no qualms about committing these acts of violence, it's more a commentary on kind of humanity in general, or rather, to come back to anti-authority, it's a failure of governments or police in a certain sense, where it's like, okay, it's not just one group in an area, it's the entire area has been soured or it's been the upkeep that is supposed to be there hasn't been there, to the degree where now they're assaulting police stations because one person got murdered.
Yeah, this is it. It's like it's pretty much turned into an us versus them situation, where everyone's common unifying bond is, well, the police have been shit to us. They don't. The community, nothing helps us. No one's helping this community, so we'll do it for ourselves. And unfortunately, because of the way it's been left, it ends up being a violent community. Realize, well, that's the way we're getting what we want, so we'll carry on doing it. It's it's hyper stylized, and obviously, to the point where it's not really something that would happen, but it's in allegorical terms, it works.
I mean, that's a talent of Carpenter's that we see grow out of this film, right? He's able to make these fantastical films that, I mean, you've got monsters in the Arctic, you've got the craziness of Sutter Kane and all of these different events, you've got New York becoming a prison island. And while the larger concepts of those films are quite fantastical, he's able to put you in the moment in a way that doesn't make it feel ridiculous, right? And I think that is a testament to his ability to craft these characters, and I mean, casting the right people and obviously the narratives that go along with them, but they're really able to make you become invested in these characters that are in ludicrous situations, and yet you're so invested in them that you don't care, right? Yeah. I mean, Escape from New York might seem a little more realistic these days, but I mean, even something like The Thing, it's this idea that like there's people that it's all about people at the beginning, and then when you isolate these people that all know each other and they're supposedly know each other better than anybody else in this area, and yet there's a monster now all of a sudden, but you're so invested in them that it's like, yeah, I can overlook the fact that like there's a monster that's infecting everybody kind of thing,
Yeah, absolutely.
Before I kind of ask you my wrap-up question, were there any moments in Assault on Precinct 13 that particularly stand out to you that I skipped over?
I mean, the thing that always makes, every time I watch the film, I always get to the point of when Napoleon asks for a smoke and finally gets one, and it takes with 20 minutes to go is about when he gets it. It's like just amazing. It's like that. I think the other thing's not said enough. I know we talked about the dynamic between Bishop and Napoleon, but also Laurie Zimmer's Lee. It's the third wheels, unfortunately, on that one, but she more than holds her own as well in that. And again, the way they light her with just the eyes across and like that, and just the slow response to things when she's asked stuff, and so it's delivered in a very old-timey way, but it makes her feel like a 1930s character, in a lot of ways, but with that sort of modern edge. And she just amazingly well. And it's like we also got the Nancy Keys as Loomis, as it is, getting her little role in there again before being seen again and again with that. But, I think it's good that they had that sort of third outlet, not just the dynamic between those two. Like Tony Burton, of course, who ends up being Apollo Creed's trainer a few years later. But,
things worked out all right for him.
Yeah, they did. It's like, again, another character where it's like they could easily have had him do the betrayal when he got to escape. He looks, they leave it a little ambiguous because they leave him at that crossroads where he's looking at the phone box to go and call. He's got that smile on his face. And I think, is he thinking I'm going to fuck off, or is he thinking I'll go and I've made it? And obviously we don't get to find out because he gets shot. And again, it's just another one of those things where it sort of leaves it without any sort of resolution, and you're kind of happy that they don't. I could see how that might be frustrating for people who like closure on things, because this film is terrible for giving closure on things. It's like, but it's another sort of string in the bow of what makes it work.
That ambiguity, though, I think is what makes it so strong. And I mean, these characters are grappling with that morality. It's like, hey, this is a person that is that's in prisons. One of them's on the way to death row. If they had a moment that they never had the opportunity to kind of like change their ways or pay for their past sins, is this that moment? And I think that kind of like, is he going for the telephone or is he going to fuck off and escape? That's a pretty pivotal moment, and leaving that ambiguous, I really like, because again, like, I don't know, I'm a fan of those ambiguous moments, because it's like, is this guy going to is he going to take the situation and really look at his life and be like, am I going to do something for good for a change, or this is just who I am and I'm going to accept that? But and you're mentioning Lee, actually, I can't believe I forgot to bring it up. I love her character because she never becomes this kind of like damsel in distress that's constantly screaming her head off and she needs help with everything. No. I mean, even when she gets shot, she never kind of like throws herself on the ground or starts screaming and stuff. She kind of just eats it. And then she goes on to like kick one of the prisoners or one of the thugs in the nuts. And then, of course, Napoleon breaks his arm. But even like when Bishop gives her the handgun to guard the door, she knows how to load it already. We don't get this kind of drawn out sequence, oh, I don't know how to use a gun kind of thing. You know, yeah. It's like she can give it as good as she takes it from this assault, as it were.
Yeah, she really does. And obviously that why she sort of connects with Napoleon so well. And again, another thing they could have done quite wishy-washy and had her sort of embrace him and do all that at the end. It's like, they didn't. She just gets in this long, lingering look. And she's like, she knows this is it. I'm probably not going to see you again now because, you know, you're going up there to go back to jail and that's it. But yeah, she clearly feels regret that it's like, he's someone I really connected with. It's just a shame that he's a murderer who's going to death row. But
that's more effective. That kind of like, oh, I could see this working out in another life kind of thing. That's more effective than it being having some kind of tender embrace with a guy that might have killed like multiple people, like you said, which in the end is not realistic at all. And kind of just, it's like, oh, well, you know, he's handsome and he's, what do they call him? They call him smooth. And it's like, oh, he's handsome and smooth. So he could just kill like 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 people. Not a big deal. But I think in kind of just wrapping up, my final question for you is, if you had to bill a John Carpenter double feature for those unfamiliar with his work, which 2 movies would you pick and why?
Ooh, now this is good because there were so many variations. I was thinking, do I make it timely, you know, as timely as it can be, or do you just sort of try and distance his work? And I thought I'd make it somewhat timely in terms of theme, which also shows how far he came in a short space of time. So, you know, boringly for everyone else, I'm sure, Assault on Precinct 13 is the first half of that, and then the second half is The Thing. Now, the common thread, as I said before, is 2 things: isolation and distrust, and how those things are handled. You know, isolation is there in different ways, as we've said. One is pure isolation, and like you have nowhere else to go. The second is enforced isolation, where you could go somewhere, but you'll be dead, you know, if you do. With the distrust, it's handled differently, as we said earlier. There's a group of people who've worked together for years, it seems, and know each other's habits, annoying or otherwise, and they are made to distrust each other by an outsider. Whereas, you know, Assault on Precinct 13 is about a bunch of outsiders technically coming into a new place and defending it against another bunch of outsiders. And yet there's, you know, the way the trust is handled there, while it gets brought up, ultimately is left a bit more up in the air about how that could be handled. So in effect, in both films, both groups are as alone as each other, you know, from the rest of the world, and they have to do what they have to rely on themselves to solve the problem. And the common thing with this is seeing how Carpenter handles that same thematic thing in such different ways, you know, in 2 different genres, in the space of 4 years, or 4 or 5 years, sorry, 6 years. So, but yeah, it's remarkable. You know, it's like, it's in the middle of his hot streak. Yes, everyone's going to, I would say, you know, see Halloween, and yes, there are deeper cuts you could make, but I think if you were really trying to get the essence of what Carpenter can do, those 2 films are really good at that. And, you know, in a time where isolation is a big thing for a lot of people, it's interesting way of seeing how that gets handled.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really liked that you highlighted just the idea that if you were to watch those films back to back, it shows you how a lot of the stylistic things that stand out in Assault on Precinct 13, how he just takes them and runs with them in a completely different genre, and yet it complements that film so much more, The Thing. And seeing how he's grown on those, right? It's not kind of like copy and pasting those early stylistic things or tendencies of his. It's him expanding on all of that. And of course, it's remarkable that he takes the stakes of The Thing, which are raised so much more than Assault on Precinct 13. It's the stakes are the end of the world in The Thing. And yet everything that he employs in Assault on Precinct 13, it works there in a heightened fashion. And it never really, you might think like, oh, if the stakes are raised, then there might start to be cracks in some of the elements that really worked in Assault on Precinct 13, because that was very much the stakes are their lives, right?
Yeah.
Whereas when you start talking about the end of the world, you might have a tendency to be like, well, maybe there's some cracks in the foundation of that, but really he personifies those things so well and refines them in a manner that, I mean, it's why that The Thing is like in the middle of that hot streak of his, right? Even if people at the time didn't realize it for whatever reason.
Yeah, and again, I think there's another common thread between them, which is the main characters end up, they're pretty much similar ways, where characters pretty much thinking, well, nothing's really going to change here, but the only way we can really make it out of here is to work together. And then the case of The Thing, that's just to sit there and die, whereas in Assault on Precinct 13, the solution is we'll work together, even though we know that death is a certainty for one of us, regardless. It's like, it's again similar sort of way of doing things, little tweaks, but like I said, two completely different movies. Yeah,
absolutely, yeah. And I think that's a great place to wrap up. But hey, man, it was a pleasure having you on to chat about Assault on Precinct and John Carpenter.
Yeah, it was very pleasant to do so, I must say.
Well, I hope to have you on again in the future sometime soon. But thanks again, man.
Absolutely, no problem. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to Daily Horror Habit on your preferred streaming service and follow the show on Instagram at Daily Horror Habit and on Twitter at Daily Horror Pod for episode updates. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.